Welcome to Space Insiders. My name's Tony Sewell, and I'm here with my fellow space nerd, Rob Riak. How you going,
Hey,
Rob?
Tony. How you doing, buddy?
Good,
Good to
mate.
see
How are
you.
you?
Great.
How's your week
Great.
been?
Summer's around the corner.
Oh,
Weather's better. It's great.
yeah.
Yep.
Kids are finishing school down here in Georgia today,
Yep.
so yeah, not long till summer holidays.
Exactly. Yeah. Looking forward to the summer.
Yeah. I've had a pretty interesting week. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see I've just started a new job. So I'm joining the Amazon Kuiper team. So I'm pretty excited about that.
You should be excited,
New
Tony.
challenge,
Tony,
yeah.
yeah, you deserve the new challenge. It's really exciting for you, and for me to see you grow and get challenged. And you're such a good leader, so really excited
Thanks,
to see
man.
what you do over there.
Appreciate it. Yeah, no, it's going to be really good. It's like kind of two goals. Like Amazon's a great company to work for, and this is a massive sort of ambitious program. So getting to take part in that, and I also get to relocate to Australia at the end of the year, and it's something I've been dreaming about and trying to convince my wife to do for some time. So I finally won that argument. So it's going to be a good adventure.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot easier to find your favorite food, the Vegemite down there,
That's right.
Tony.
Yeah, and meat pies.
That's right. I like meat pies, actually.
Yeah,
They're pretty
they're good. Awesome. All right. Well, we've got a great guest coming on today, Brett Alexander. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about Brett before we get into the news, Rob?
Brett is incredible. I don't know how else to really. I don't know how to even intro him.
This is going to be really fun.
Yeah, he's not only I would consider him a good friend of mine, but he has been probably my number one mentor in this industry, going back only about 5 or 6 years ago. But this is someone who is currently has his own consulting firm. Having just served in the role of chief revenue officer at Firefly Aerospace, which we'll talk a lot about. He was one of the early employees at Blue Origin, so lots to talk about there. Very excited about that. He's also been pretty influential in his career around policy. He authored Vision for Space Exploration following the Columbia accident.
Oh, wow. I
A
didn't know
very
that.
trying time there, very emotional
He worked at the
time.
White House too.
He did. He worked for the White House. And he was also the president of the Commercial Space Flight Federation. We can talk a little bit about that, about that for those that don't know about it. But nonprofit organizations that bring industry together, and he's been a leader there as well. And he also, he started his career at FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation. So everything from the beginning to where he is now. I don't know if we've talked to anyone yet that has such
government policy, startups,
round
big
trip
enterprise. Yeah, it's going to be really.
And so
good.
when you and I were talking about doing this podcast, I think I remember telling you, I said that there's one person we really, if we can get to talk to him, it's Brett. So very excited to talk to him.
Yeah, cool. I got to meet him late last year, I think, when we were in LA. He's a fun guy. This will be a good one.
Yeah.
All right, a couple of news stories that we wanted to talk about today. We'll talk about the NRO budget cuts or potential budget cuts second. But I wanted to just quickly touch on this one, which I thought was pretty interesting. So there was an article in Space News yesterday about Endurosat. They're a Bulgarian satellite manufacturer. They just raised 44 million euros in a round led by the Founders Fund, which is the VC that was founded by Peter Thiel. I thought this was pretty interesting because I saw a quote also yesterday from I guess there was a small sat conference going on in Europe, and there was an exec from a European small sat manufacturer who was on a panel, and he said that Trump is the best business developer in our team. And this is an interesting story because it kind of overlays this new sort of optimism, I think, amongst defense and space companies in Europe, and the opportunity that they're getting from this increased focus on local spending on defense. But it is interesting, I think, that such a prominent American VC is investing in a European company. Obviously, they see optimism in the European market and perhaps confidence that tariffs aren't going to be as big a barrier to the US market as what we see sort of every day. And I think you've also got to see there's got to be connection to some of their other portfolio companies. They talk about Varda Space, but anyway, I thought that was a pretty interesting investment.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past. I think if people haven't skimmed or read in detail the rearm strategy coming out of Europe around their defense and national security investments that they want to plan over the next, I can't remember how many years, maybe it's 10 years, um, is pretty exciting. And I think for anybody that's, building a space company, a defense company, defense tech, or an investor has to be global. I mean, this is a great example of that because there's
Mm.
going to be investment dollars in places in the world that you've never seen. And I think, especially in the market where you're about to participate, Tony, on these global constellations, trying to serve the remaining 70% of those that are not connected on the internet, there's going to be a whole host of new businesses that spawn out of that, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, what I loved about this article was, um, how companies now are actually making those investments. And there's companies in Europe that are raising enough money from investors, global investors from other countries that see opportunity,
yeah.
for a lot of these
That's
firms.
a big chunk of change, $49 million. So,
Yeah, it is.
all right. Just all right. Quickly moving on to the second story. So, there was an announcement about NRO potentially cutting the commercial imagery budget by a third, and this was kind of in with the background of GeoInt going on. Was it this week or last week? This week, I think it
Last week.
was last
Yeah, it's
week,
last week. Yeah.
and how the NRO was conspicuously absent from that conference. Obviously, a lot of EO companies, commercial companies, really rely on these contracts. I know you had a few thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I think in terms of I did not go to the GeoInt conference this year, but had a lot of colleagues that did, and I think a lot of people weren't necessarily they weren't really surprised by the thin attendance. I think we've been
Mm,
seeing that since the beginning of the year, mostly due to some actions from Doge. But what at first when I read this article was pretty troubling because when you think about, um, how important satellite imagery is now for national security and intelligence, taking pictures, trying to identify and track the bad guys or whatever that might be, is something that the government's been doing for quite some time now, acquiring actually the data from various defense contractors that operate satellites, but over the last 5 to 10 years, more commercial companies that are actually now taking pictures and they're selling to government. But to be able to to read this and see that there's a confirmed 30% reduction, for commercial imagery spending in the FY26 budget was to me a little bit troubling.
mm,
But then, I don't know. I kind of thought about it a little bit. And I just, I don't know. Maybe this is the optimist in me. M- Maybe what this might be doing is trying to incentivize a different type of behavior, on the government side, which is maybe it's not just buying all raw data from satellite operators and manufacturers, payload, designers and operators, but maybe it's actually trying to
down
influence the market to build
or the
capabilities that
downstream,
deliver the insights,
the
right?
downstream
So
stuff. Yeah,
yeah, so what about what about just buying the
yeah,
insights or the intelligence
mm,
versus all the raw data? Because if you think about it, if you are let's say you're a commercial real estate developer, you're trying to figure out where to build a new multifamily housing facility. You might want the satellite imagery for various things. What are the flood lines? Um, are they on a fault line? All these different things
yeah,
that they do to make a good investment. They'd have to hire people that would have to build systems to process the data and make sense of it. So maybe this is the optimist in me is thinking that maybe this is about potentially changing behavior, and the markets should pay attention to
yeah,
this. If you're going to start a company or if you're going to work for a company, I feel like a geospatial analytic type firm or one that builds the algorithms, it might be a nice
mm.
place to kind of focus on, especially given the
But
sense that
definitely
the
for the
government is a huge funder for this
yeah,
kind
well,
of
and definitely
stuff.
for the commercial applications.
Yeah.
Yeah, the analytics piece is important.
And the one thing
Cool.
too, I was going to
Mm,
say, Tony, because again, we talk about how we also want to educate people that listen to us. When you do read this article, and again, we'll provide the link in there. There's two specific terms that might be confusing to people. One is the electro-optical commercial layer, which is basically is satellites that take pictures. They're like
mm,
they take photos. And then there's this concept of synthetic aperture radar, SAR-based satellites, and they use, different types of waveforms to actually look through clouds and can actually take not take pictures, but they can actually get information from, you know, of the surface even during the nighttime. So if you look at these types of technologies, it's really interesting to read about how the combination of both can actually help with various types of use cases. Don't get scared by the terms,
Yeah.
but it's very interesting to learn about, and it'll be helpful when you understand why certain types of companies are doing certain types of things.
Yeah, and it's cool if you haven't seen these types of images before, just to go to a few of the websites, companies like Capella and Black Sky and Maxar, just to see the different sort of profiles and the level of detail they provide. It's pretty interesting stuff. All right. Well, I think this is probably a good point for us to get to our interview with Brett. What do you reckon?
Sounds great. I can't wait to talk to him.
All right. See you in a minute. All right. Welcome back to the show and welcome, Brett Alexander. Thanks for joining us and good to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm
Hey,
excited.
Brett. So good to see you. Thanks for doing this with us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So, I just want to tell you, and we talked a little bit about this in our intro, is that when Tony and I were discussing, even the idea of doing this podcast, the first person that came to mind for me was you. So, to be honest with you, we're very grateful you're taking the time to talk to us because of your background, the history. You being such a mentor for me, it's really it means a lot that you're doing this. So, thank you so much.
It's very kind of you to say. Thank you.
Well, it's true. So let's get started with this. So you had such a diverse background, everything from working in government, policy, and working in commercial space. The first question we have is, how did you take that journey? Why did you take that journey? And how did it? Why did it stick? Why have you gone done this whole thing from soup to nuts in this industry across so many different roles? It's very unique. So just love to understand how that happened.
You bet. So I really have 30 plus years in the space industry, but space has been a thing for me from the very beginning. So I grew up in Miami, Florida. I was a space fan. I don't think I remember the Apollo landings. I would have been maybe 4.5 or 5 by the last landing. Um, but I was a space fan when they were building the space shuttle. My mom took me up to Cape Canaveral to see the very first shuttle launch. So I was there in April 12th, 1981. By coincidence, or later, was able to be at the very last shuttle launch and landing. So I got wheels up and wheels
Oh,
down
wow.
of 30-year program
Mm.
of the space shuttle. Um, but space has always had a hold on me. And I think that is true for a lot of people in the space industry. They get bit at a younger age and stick with it. So I'm not sure it was by choice or by design. It was just by the way it was going to be. So when I went to college, I went to the University of Virginia. I majored in aerospace engineering. I got a bachelor's and master's. I didn't come out of that wanting to be a strict engineer and design parts. This was early 90s. So I came to Washington and started doing programmatics for Air Force Space and SDI, which was the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, and NASA and stuff like that. And that brought me into the Washington space community, and I've been here ever since.
Can you that's great. And I think what would be really interesting for people to understand, I mean, and for us to really learn from is, how would you summarize the change in how the space market, like what kind of changes it made from that whole period? Because it's made a lot of different pivots and alterations over the years. I think from the early 2000, especially, I think that's when the space shuttle program was decommissioned. Right, that's when the space shuttle was decommissioned.
Last flight in 2011, yeah.
2011, sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
2011. So I mean, there's just been a lot of different changes, and so what is that? How would you summarize that throughout your career?
Yeah, I mean, first I'd say there is a very dynamic space community or space industry now. The ecosystem of companies that are entrepreneurial, that are building spacecraft, that are doing things in space, building rockets, etc. That dynamic environment did not exist 30 years ago when I got to this town. It was government
Yeah.
driven. Now, a lot of what's happening today is still government driven. Government's in the background, but there is a legitimate ecosystem around that that's bringing private sector money and new approaches and proliferation of companies, not all of which will be successful, but many of them will. And it's a much more dynamic situation than it was before. And I think the thing that I've tried to be involved in through that is the commercial side and helping to get government to jumpstart that. Because if you go back and you really look at what caused this dynamic situation, the government changing its acquisition strategies, particularly NASA, in the mid 2000s with the COTS program, and then later with Commercial Crew, that really jump started something that has led to a lot of this. It would not be the same without that. So I think of them as a prime mover in commercial space, even though they are the government still, right?
That's super interesting. It's made me think of, I'd never really thought of the fact that like 30 years ago, like the path to a career in space was through engineering. There wasn't really a business path or an entrepreneurship path. That's got to be a massive difference to where we are today.
Right. In the late 90s, there were a number of companies trying to do launch vehicles that were private, that were raising money. And all of that went away after the spacecraft side, after Iridium and Globalstar, and then Teledesic, which came up in the late 90s or were developed over a 10-year period of the 90s, actually launched spacecraft, right? So Iridium and Globalstar launched into orbit in 98, 99, 2000, and promptly went bankrupt. Right? Yeah. They each spent about $6 billion. $1 billion of that was on launches, but they spent about $6 billion, and they ended up with a phone that was the size of a brick that was $8 a minute. And in that 10-year period it took to develop all that, cell service had rolled out across the country and across the world, and nobody needed this one heavy brick phone that only worked inside or outside, and so they've had to change their business models. They're still around, but they've been through bankruptcies to still be here and change their business models. And so the business side of things really stopped for a while. And then you had billionaires get into the game, or multimillionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson get into the space business in the early 2000s. Then you had NASA try to do some commercial things through COTS and later Commercial Crew. And together that ecosystem develops that is much more, what we see today.
Yeah. What was
equity coming in too?
What was COTS again, Brett? Because there is that element too during that time where NASA was trying to be more, maybe more of an anchor tenant to some of these programs versus kind of the owner operator. So is that an example? What really is COTS again?
So COTS was a Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program. And it was started by Mike Griffin when he was administrator. So in the 2005 time, he announced it. 2006, first contract awards to SpaceX and a company called Rocket Plane Kistler, which later failed. And then Orbital Sciences came in as the second company. That's now Northrop Grumman. And those two still provide the services today, which is cargo to the space station, right? So recognizing and understanding that the shuttle would be going away at some point. So this is after the Columbia accident in 2003. The Vision for Space Exploration, which came out in 2004. I was at the White House for all of this and was involved in helping to craft that. Said we're going to go back to the moon, and we're going to do that after we finish the space station, make it operational, and then retire the space shuttle. So knowing that the shuttle was going to be going away, there was no way to get cargo to and from the station other than the Russians or the Europeans, the Japanese, but we needed our own capabilities. And so Administrator Griffin looked at that as a market that he could provide from the government with some seed money to help develop the capabilities, but do it in a commercial way where those capabilities could also be used for other things besides what NASA needed. And that led to Falcon 9, that led to Antares, that led to both Cygnus and Dragon, and a lot of the other activity that we came from, or that we see now, was sparked by all of that.
Yeah, that's cool. So I mean, that's a good segue to kind of a discussion on launch. Last 2 weeks ago, we interviewed Chris Capon, a founder of a software company in Australia called Zendia, and towards the end of the interview, we were talking about the Australian space industry, and he had some views on a lot of the attention that launch was getting in Australia, and did Australia really need a sovereign launch capability, and it was sucking up a lot of investment. And I'm sort of interested to get your perspective on someone that's had so much experience working with launch companies in the US. Like, how much room is there for these new launch companies, and what's really going to separate the winners from the losers, do you think?
Yeah. So I have been involved in launch from the very beginning of my career. Air Force space launch was sort of the first thing that I worked on. Um, Writing up 30-day forecasts of Delta II launches, Atlas II launches, and it was largely driven by government. And of course, now what we see with large numbers of Falcon 9 launches each year, where a large number of those are Starlink related, which is commercial, and then the rest of their manifest is divided between some commercial satellites, but also government, NASA type activities, national security as well. So when you look across, launch has gone from something that was a dozen times a year, and half a dozen for a vehicle was a good year, to over 100 for a particular launch vehicle now, and a whole bunch of other activities and other companies as well launching things. So the amount of satellites getting into space, the amount of launches, the number of these activities has grown exponentially. I think it's going to continue to grow in terms of mass to orbit. New launch vehicles are coming in, but is there room for everybody? I think the answer is yes, as long as they're not all the same, right? If
So
you look
how?
at the
Yeah.
automotive industry or the aviation industry, right, you have differentiated niches where there are vehicles that people will pay for because they need that. If you are a small spacecraft company and you're building a spacecraft and you want to demonstrate it on orbit, you can fly on a Falcon 9 transporter mission along with 100 other spacecraft, and you can do it for a very low price point. But if you want that satellite to go to a very specific orbit that not everybody else is going to, and the transporter's not going to, then you need your own ride.
Right.
And so there is a market for that class of a small launch vehicle that will continue. And then you have these large LEO constellations that are also, you can put 10 satellites on one launch vehicle, you can put 50 on another, and you want a mix of providers to get you there, a mix of capabilities. And so there is market for a number of providers there. So I think the launch market remains dynamic, just as the satellite market remains dynamic, and will continue to evolve over time. But I think there's room for many players.
It is pretty interesting, I think, how some of these companies like SpaceX, and I think about like Rocket Lab, how they've really kind of taken that launch heritage and turned themselves into Rocket Lab is an alternative sort of aerospace integrator that's going to be competing with the big guys. Like, it's amazing how they're sort of operating in a whole range of different segments now.
They're diversifying a lot.
Launch is just a small part of their business now.
And they're diversifying, right? And hypersonics and all.
Yeah. So there are very few what we think of as space companies that have the full value chain, right? The launch, the spacecraft, the in-orbit services, the data services, and all sorts of other things, ground segment as well. And so those companies, whether they're small right now, are looking at it much more holistically than someone who says, I'm going to do very well in one niche, and I'm going to provide either comms or imagery or whatever it is from space, where they have a niche. But there are companies, I think Rocket Lab, Firefly, SpaceX are companies that have much broader perspective on things, on what they're doing.
Mm.
Companies like Blue Origin can jump into that, although they
Mm.
don't currently right now have spacecraft that they are providing services with or something. But there is a number of companies out there that are looking at it from that perspective, and then there are plenty more that are not. They're saying, nope, I'm going to do this one thing. I'm going to do it well.
Yeah, speaking of Blue Origin, Brett, one of the things that we definitely want to talk to you about was your time there, because you were there for, I think, over 12 years or close to 12 years.
Yeah, almost
Um,
15 with consulting. Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, I'd love to. We'd love to hear more about what was that like in the early years, and how did you, how did you operate as a team, as a leader? How did you interface with government? How did you interface with Jeff Bezos, and his vision? It's a pretty open question, but I think a lot of people really are curious as to. There were a number of years where people kind of heard of Blue Origin, but it wasn't until many years later there was actually a vehicle where it was public and you can actually see it work.
Right.
Specifically New Shepard, obviously, but yeah, what was that like being there, especially in the early years?
Well, I will say, great company, great people, great leadership, and I really think they're going to be a juggernaut in the industry in the future. When I started as a consultant for them, there were 75 people. And when I left a couple of years ago, it was 11,000 people.
Wow.
So in my mind, there's a lot of different Blue Origins and a lot of different aspects or phases that it went through. But early on, I would say the things that came through, which was it was about achieving the end goal of millions of people living and working in space incrementally, step by step, ferociously. That's the motto of Gratitum Ferociter. Um, and it really wasn't about um, the business of a space company, meaning it was about building a space company, building a company that builds rockets and spacecraft, et cetera, rather than the business around it in terms of trying to get financing or making a profit. And that's because the founder, Jeff Bezos, had enough money and said,
Mm.
don't worry about that part. This is a long-term endeavor, 20, 30 years. I'm in it for the long haul. We don't need to do that. Um, that did change after we engaged with government, which is what I was brought in to do. Hey, go talk to NASA, but don't tell them anything. But start engaging with NASA as it was opening the doors to commercial programs, et cetera. And then let's use that interaction to help Blue Origin develop New Shepard and then New Glenn, et cetera.
Your your experience working with him, and sort of interacting with him directly is obviously pretty unique. And I mean, Rob and I are sort of, I consider us Amazon veterans. So we're products of his vision and the way that he thinks about customers and running a company. But I've never met the guy. Um, uh, what can you tell us a little bit about his leadership style, as opposed to, obviously he has this public persona, but obviously very, very different to work with. Can you tell us a little, just give us a few sort of insights into that sort of relationship you had with him?
I would say from the beginning he is, if not the smartest person I've ever met, then at least in the top two.
Mm.
Very quick, very analytical, and very attentive to what you are saying, which does mean you need to have your
Across
facts
your brief.
right. You need to know what you're talking about and be able to defend it, stand behind it, or say, well, my knowledge only goes so far. I've had him say, well, you know more about this than I do, so we'll go with your view on something. Surprising to me. I've also had him tell me, clearly you have no idea what you're doing, which he was right, because that was about building a website. And not my expertise. I think he's done one or two of those before. And a very demanding leader and a very tough
Mm.
leader, but a very, I thought, fair leader as well. And after some of the toughest moments, couple hours later, it's, hey, we're going over to this place. Let's go get a drink together. Right. So no hard feelings left after that. Um, and so those interactions were always, in general, positive for me, even when I didn't live up to my, let's say, potential in those. Um, Leadership of the company, I think the company can use more of his attention and time. And I think it's getting that more now than it did certainly during the COVID time, when he really had to focus on Amazon. And before that, when there was a pattern of him being there on Wednesdays, one day a week, and then Saturdays once a month, when we had those sort of interactions. But the more time he spends with Blue, I think the better off Blue is.
Yes, and how would you describe the culture over there, Brett? And did you take anything away from Blue Origin as a commercial space company to your next endeavor, your next role?
I certainly took a lot away personally. In terms of culture, the culture was of engineering excellence, and it
Hmm.
was, I would say that could be painstakingly slow. And I think a lot of the criticism that people have said about Blue Origin, and I think that I would agree with, is that it has been very slow. And I think Jeff would agree with that too. It's been very slow to develop the capabilities that it has. But the engineering excellence part of it is that the people really understand what they're doing, and the design of it, and all of the nuances. And so that culture of caring about the end product, caring about space, being passionate about it, being willing to argue technically back and forth about decision making, and then disagree, but commit to the path that's chosen. Right. That was one of the leadership principles called disagree and commit. I think very much taken to heart there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
No, that's good. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about with a couple folks in our first few episodes was like, our I think Tony and I have this interest in what does it take to lead a company in this market, and trying to tease out, how different is it, because most people I think that are in this industry do have engineering backgrounds, or they worked at NASA or some other, space company, or maybe a defense contractor. Um, and there might not be as many business people that have background in this industry because it's kind of new in that sense. It is, right. How do you really make money? I mean, you and I even talked about that last summer when we were thinking through, is there a digital business that can be built within a launch provider? What does that look
Right.
like? We're talking about moving up the value chain. Is that one of them? And I think trying to convince um, engineers that there's an opportunity there is difficult, but also I think there's a bit of uh, learning that needs to be done on the investor side as well about what that could look like. You know, just because you have this kind of disconnect, you have the engineers that maybe there's not as many that are lacking, or that have the business experience, and you have a lot of the investors with business experience and not enough industry domain expertise, and so being able to kind of meet in the middle is difficult, right? So so yeah, I find that interesting in this particular market. And maybe here's a question I do have for you along those lines is when you were a chief revenue officer, um, did you have that challenge too? I mean, what was it like to try to be a chief revenue officer at a a launch company? I mean, that must have been a challenge in trying to break new ground.
Yeah, so I was chief revenue officer at Firefly Aerospace for under 2 years, about 18 months. And Firefly is majority owned by a private equity firm. And so the attention to revenue, and to the balance sheet, is very different there from where I had come from, Blue Origin, which had a single owner, who had often said, don't worry about the profit part of it. So what I thought I understood was only a part of what I needed to make that work. Very much focused on the dollars coming in, the phasing of that money, you know, um, the return on long term investment, et cetera.
Mm.
Companies like that have to be much more focused on getting the product to market, so that the revenue comes in, right? You don't book the revenue for a launch vehicle until you launch it, or for a spacecraft until that spacecraft is up and operating. Whereas when you're doing, let's say, the lunar lander program, which they have Blue Ghost, or other things where you're working directly with the government, you're getting milestone payments that maybe look different on a balance sheet. And so there's different ways of doing it. So but you are always focused on the health of the company and the run rate that you have and how long can you continue like that. And so you are much more focused on the immediate products and getting them to market. Whereas other companies like at Blue Origin, we had diversified into 30 different activities before, let's say, New Shepard was flying people, or New Glenn had its first flight, kind of thing. So that diversification came before the business became, let's say, profitable or self-sustaining, or going concern. So it certainly taught me a lot. And as chief revenue officer, because government is a large part of that, um, the revenue side, I also did government relations, had government relations for it. So you're also working with Congress and the administration on a regular basis as well. And so you're balancing all of that, looking out at, signing commercial deals for launches, signing government deals or contracts for spacecraft, lunar landers, as well as in space capabilities, and then working on policy with with Congress as well.
Cool. Last serious question before we get to the fun stuff at the end with Rob. I mean, beyond launch, sort of looking 5 to 10 years ahead, what sectors excite you the most in space, and what do you think? What are some of the ones that you reckon might be overhyped?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the lunar economy and the push to open up the moon and cislunar space to the economic sphere. That was a quote from the science advisor John Marburger back in 2004, when President Bush announced the vision for space exploration about going back to the moon, and really about bringing the moon into the Earth economic sphere, for the first time, really. And I think we're not there yet, but we're on that path. And so the next 5-10 years, I think it's incredibly important that that NASA still have the Artemis program and still take American astronauts and international astronauts back to the surface of the moon. But all of the things that go with that, lunar resources in terms of ISRU, as well as, let's say, helium-3 extraction and bringing that back, position, navigation, timing on the moon, around the moon, comm services, power services, all of the things that you need there to have a thriving ecosystem and to have activity there. I think there's a lot of potential businesses, as well as potential, there's science benefit, but it's the business side of it that I think brings it into the economic sphere of Earth, if you will. So I'm very bullish on that. I do think that with this administration and future administrations, just as we've had in the last 5 years, that the push on the national security space side, now with Space Force being its own service, but just the push for new capabilities because of the threat environment, because of peer competitors. I think that the Space Force budget is going to increase substantially. I think those capabilities. I don't think we understand exactly what capabilities are going to be needed. What is Golden Dome? Is it interceptors in space? Is it lasers in space? Is it ground based? Is it we don't actually know that. But the effort that goes into that will drive a lot of the economic opportunity, in the space industry as well. So those are the two things that I think I'm going to be bullish on. In terms of things that I'm I think are overhyped. I don't have too many that come to mind. There are a lot of launch companies in the world. I think the ones that are launching today are going to be successful, or in general. I don't see a lot of space for new companies to be getting into that business, 5 or 10 years from now. But you just don't know that either. You really don't.
Real quick, what is the national security concern in Lunar, in your opinion?
It's really about being able to hide something out there and come back without anybody knowing you're coming back. So coming back unwarned, and then you can come back to geostationary orbit and do something nefarious without being tracked. So I think that's part of it. And then there's also the geopolitical concern of, let's say, China getting to the South Pole of the moon with people and saying, this is our exclusive economic zone, and you can't come within, a couple hundred kilometers of where we are. And that happens to include all the lunar ice that could be used for hydrogen or something like that. So that's a more geopolitical concern than a national security concern, but I think it's a valid one. And so I do think that that it's not the same sort of space race as we had in the 60s, but it is a very important competition in terms of the next 100 years of which economic and political system is going, governance, rule of law, is going to govern space activity beyond Earth.
Yeah, I asked because that's the I can't seem to wrap my head around like what is the national security concern with Lunar, but obviously there's a good reason, and it sounds like as simple as having the higher ground is like really really important, right? Especially new frontiers. Yeah. So Brett, thank you so much. We have one last question. This is the fun question, hopefully, and we're trying to do this because we want listeners to try to get to know you a little bit more personally. So, hopefully this kind of helps there. So with your background, I'm sure you've had a lot of these, but what is the dumbest question that someone has asked you that involves space? A dumb space question and it could be something you laugh at or something that really drives you crazy.
Well, it's not really a dumb question, but people often ask why satellites aren't just sitting overhead all the time. Right. And that's an orbital dynamics question, right? You can sit over a spot on the equator, 24 hours a day, but only if you're out at a certain, altitude, 22,300 miles, right? Kind of thing. But people genuinely don't understand why they can't, why the satellite isn't right above them all the time. Like a cell tower could be there and the satellite's just above you. And so why they're moving and all of that. So it's not really a dumb question. It's just something that, people haven't really thought of in that way.
No, I'm glad you're saying it's not a dumb question because I'm pretty sure that probably was one of my first questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I will tell you, back in my first job, we had a bunch of folks. So I was a support for the Air Force, but we had a bunch of folks from the government, interagency, State Department, Commerce Department, Transportation, and others come over, and we taught orbital dynamics 101 using a beach ball and a hula hoop. And you can say, okay, if you're in orbit and you are a hula hoop, you cannot be above the North Pole. You cannot be above the South Pole. You have to be, the axis has to go through the center of the Earth. And that made people go, oh, okay, I get it. That's why you're always moving around.
So we definitely have to do a video of you doing that in part 2 of this session.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. Something for the flat earthers out there.
That's right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Brett, thanks again for joining us. It's been super interesting. I appreciate you sharing some of those stories. And for our listeners out there, if people want to get in touch with you, Brett, where is the best place to find you?
Yeah, Gmail, bretton.alexander@gmail.com. That's BRETTON.Alexander.
All right, awesome. We'll make sure we put a copy of that into the show notes. And for our listeners, thanks again for joining us. If you like what you're hearing, we'd love for you to recommend us to a friend and write a review. That'd really, really help us. We're not it's not a full-time job for us yet, despite what you might think. podcasting doesn't pay, but it's a lot. We're having a lot of fun doing it. So we appreciate everyone following. So
thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Brett.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Tony.
See you guys.